Welcome to the OK Book Club, where we dive into books, stories, people, and tons of different topics. And today we will talk about the letter E. Yes, a podcast all about the letter E. We'll dive into its history, its sound, how it's spelled, its use in our language, and tons of different fun facts. The history of the letter E goes all the way back, it can be argued, to Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. It was originally an Egyptian hieroglyphic. It was, if you look at it, it's like almost like a man, woman looking to the left with his hands up as if he's saying hallelujah. And this is mostly referred to as like a praying human figure. And that evolved into our direct ancestor of the English language, the Phoenician alphabet. And at that time, it looked like a window or a fence, and it actually represented today the consonant H, as in the H sound. From there, it was the Greeks. They adopted the Phoenician alphabet, but they had no use for this particular character, this consonant character. So they shifted it to use it as a vowel. And they renamed this letter epsilon. So this was the letter E in the Greek alphabet that took the sound of E. And the sound E originally, right, the long vowel sound of today's letter E, that for a short time in the Greek language was represented by this other actual letter called eta. But that had a short history, as the history of languages go, and today in the Greek language, you don't have this sound E. But just to, again, go back to the history of what the actual letter looked like, it started off as a praying man. The Phoenician representation of the letter E back then, I mentioned it looked like a window or a fence. If you actually look at it, it's as if it's a rake, bent down diagonally to the left. And the epsilon letter is actually the opposite. It's almost as if it's the current letter E, but if you look at it, it's kind of like bent down to the right. And it's interesting because the historians actually look at this and they said that the actual Greeks changed the way that the letter E looked because it was easier to write it as you were writing from left to right. And from here, we know that the Romans took over Greece and the Greek civilization. The Roman language, the Roman alphabet was Latin, and the E evolved into looking like and sounding like the letter E that we know today. Now, before we dive into all the ways we use this great letter E in our language today, the English language, we need to go back and understand basically what happened, not just with this one letter, but all of our letters in terms of the history of the English language. And this will definitely be a future episode because there's so much to talk about here. But just know, for our wonderful letter E, we had at the beginning, the way our language was spoken was dramatically different over the years, beginning in about the year 450. It originally developed from these West Germanic tribes, these dialects, different ways that they spoke. There were the Angles, there were the Saxons, and there were the Jutes. And they settled in Britain, starting, like I said, in around the year 450. Well, 500 years later, In the year 1066, this fellow by the name of William from France, he was the Duke of Normandy. They called him William the Conqueror. He ended up at the Battle of Hastings taking over England and became the King of England. So what happened? The elites, people in government, the rich people in England were speaking French. The commoners, most of the regular people in England still spoke English. This evolved into this new hybrid of a language, which, again, over a period of 300 years, up until about 1400, we had this new way that the English language was pronounced and spelled because we had a new influx of the French language into English. We call this today the Middle English period. Ultimately, this evolved into what we now know as and what we call the Modern English period. But here's the point. You have these years, ultimately, same country, quote, same language, but you cannot decipher the difference. If you go back in time, there's no way. It's like a different language, Old English, Middle English. And those of us that have studied Shakespeare can see this dramatically in how difficult it is to be able to understand how Shakespeare wrote. But even if you go back even further, it's totally different. So our letter E was affected by all of this. And you add into all these changes the fact that England became the world power and moved all over the globe. And ultimately, whether it was India, whether it was Asia, whether it was the Americas, ultimately so many different languages were fused into this new hybrid of a language, and that's why it's so complex. Add to this something called this great vowel shift. Yes, this is another story that affected the letter E. The short vowel sound, wasn't affected, but the E sound was pronounced more like A back in Middle English. So this is why we have so many different spellings for the long E sound along with all the other vowels. I mean, it's crazy, and it gets complicated, no doubts. But what happened over a period of 300 years, that the way we pronounce the vowels, it ended up being pronounced higher up in the mouth. In other words, our tongue moved up. So again, this is why the letter E goes from A to E. And like I said, we have so many different spellings that don't match the way we actually talk. And it goes back to this shift in our language. And what messed up this even more? That this shift happened after the printing press was introduced into England around the 1470s. Gutenberg famously invented a printing press, and now everything that we were speaking in our language was now down on paper. So think about it. They had to standardize the spellings of all the ways we spoke. This standardization happened prior to the vowel sounds being shifted. So ultimately, this is the other, I know it gets complicated, but this is the other part that made everything all messed up. So I hope I haven't confused you. If you're still here with me, let's get to our fantastic letter E. And today, the reality of the letter E. Well, guess what? It's the most common letter used in our language. It's in almost 13% of every word. When you break down the vowels, it's used 30% of the time, and the letter A and letter I are only used 20% of the time. Our language has 26 letters, which make up 44 sounds, which, as again, we've talked about the entire podcast, it's all these sounds are spelled almost 200 different ways. The letter E is spelled 17 different ways. So here we go. The sound the short vowel sound, is spelled 91% of the time with just the letter E. And then the most common spelling for after that is the letter EA, 4% of the time. Then, believe it or not, you have a spelling of A for AI, IE, EE, EI, and EO. EO is leopard, and EI is heifer. Are you kidding me? Apparently this is a young female cow. The E sound, the long E sound, is spelled 8 different ways, with the top spelling not being E. The top spelling is with the letter Y, closely followed up by the letter E. Then you have, at 6%, EE, EA. You also have what we call E consonant silent E. And you also have EY as in key, IE as in cookie, and you have EI as in Keith. And finally, the letter E is spelled with this schwa sound. Schwa. Yes, future episode. A lot of people don't even know what a schwa is, but if you look at the letter E as in debate, as in the word enough, how about the letter camera with the letter E falling in the middle, and then at the end of words like problem or open, how is that pronounced, that letter E? Well, that's the unstressed syllable, and the sound that it makes is almost like the short vowel U, debate, enough. And speaking of enough, I think a lot of you listening to this, if you're with me still at this point, are probably saying enough of the letter E. But let's wrap up this podcast with some fun facts for the letter E and the top 5 most interesting things about the letter E. Fun facts. The most popular word in the English language is the word the, and the E is at the end, and yes, it's a schwa sound. So many different words incorporate the letter E, from email to eBay. You've got movies, E.T., Wall-E. You've got words like the emergency room, ER. You've got the letter E used in math, the basis and foundations of calculus and compound interest. This letter E is actually known as Euler's number, which is 2.71828. There was this book written in 1939 by Ernest Vincent Wright, 50,000 words, and he didn't use the letter E once. The book was called Gatsby. The Beatles famously got rid of the second E. It's not the beetle, the insect, but it's the beat. It's the Beats, the Beatles. And yes, believe it or not, I know a lot of you have thought of this. Using the letter E as a grade? Nope, not anymore. It used to be failing. A, B, C, D. What happened to the E? Why do you skip over to the F? E was eliminated as a grade because too often they thought it was E for excellent. So failing is not E anymore, it's F. So let's wrap up our podcast on the letter E with the top 5 most interesting facts about the letter E. The most common letter used in the English language. Number 5, the E sound used to be pronounced A. So feet, a long time ago, was fate. Number 4, the original E ancestor goes back to this praying person who actually was the consonant H, what we know as the H sound. Number 3, This letter has got 3 different sounds spelled 17 different ways. Number 2, this letter is silent at the end of so many words. It's called the silent E. We never talked about it. But for young learners, this is so foundational to be able to pronounce certain words. So using the letter E, you've got the word pet that is pronounced p-et. But if you add the letter E to the end of pet, it's no longer pet, it's Pete. P-e-t. That's silent. Silent E. We forget about it as adults, but it's so important for young learners. So hop becomes hope. Finally, the number 1 interesting fact about the letter E is it is pronounced It takes the schwa sound in the most common word. The most common letter used in the English language is used in the most popular word, the. And yeah, it's pronounced the schwa sound. Friends, children, adults, thanks for staying with me in this episode of the letter E. This has been the OK Book Club podcast. Reach out to me at kevmok@gmail.com for any questions, comments. And if you could rate and review me on Apple Podcasts, that would be wonderful. Until next time, friends, thank you and keep learning.